welcome.
Howdy.
This is an exciting day for the We Are for Good podcast.
Really awesome day.
Not only are we going global with our first international guest, but we are time traveling because it's already a day ahead for our friend Leigh.
The magic of the international dateline at work.
Yes. Hi, Leigh. Welcome to the Good Podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. And so Leigh has just so many incredible chapters to her story. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. One, she's the host of The Good Problem, which is, and I love this terminology, a podcast series unpacking the sticky art of doing good. Is there any greater adjective that would describe the art of the development world than sticky? That is perfection. So she's been working in the do-good sector for the last 15 years. She has set up her own NGO in Cambodia. She worked as a human rights monitor. She won a ton of awards. She says she burned out. We're all guilty of this. Yep. She had 2 children. Way to go, Mama Bear. And learned a lot of lessons, set up a consulting company, wrote a book, traveled the world, blah, blah, blah. I mean, co-founded a ReThink Orphanage Network. I mean, she is a busy, busy woman from across the pond. Hi, Leigh. It's so good to talk to you. Can you kind of dive in a little bit and tell us about your journey into the nonprofit world and how you first got started and where it's led you to today?
Sure. I was an accidental entry into the nonprofit world. I was traveling overseas and had been traveling for a couple of years in my very early 20s and was a bit lost, was really not sure what I was going to do. And I finally decided to head home to Australia and study what I thought was going to be naturopathy, natural medicine. And on my way home, I thought, hey, I'll stop off in Cambodia and do some volunteer work. Never had volunteered before, had no qualifications to volunteer, by the way. But
that's the best way to start.
The naive 23-year-old thought that I could do it all. So I headed on my way back to Australia through Southeast Asia. I first stopped in Vietnam and had my first volunteering experience there, which was actually not intentional. I was in a backpackers hostel, and this was very early days where there weren't a lot of independent kind of travelers going through Vietnam. It was mostly tour groups. So there was this one little backpacker hostel, and on the wall of the hostel communal area, I saw a poster that said, "Come and volunteer in the orphanage." And I kind of looked at it and went, oh, why would you do that? And then the person that was sitting next to me said, oh, look, you haven't been here if you haven't done it. And I kind of
peer pressure volunteerism.
Yeah. And I kind of thought, oh, that is strange. But you know, I was very young and I didn't have any kind of reference points to kind of place that within. So I thought, okay, well, I better do it. So I went, turned up to the orphanage the next day, didn't need to do anything except turn up at the front door. And myself and a couple of other backpackers were just kind of thrown in the deep end, feeding, washing, playing with severely disabled children. And, you know, for me, it was very confronting. I had never worked with disabled children before. I didn't speak the language. I had no context. I didn't understand the culture. And the conditions that these children in were really awful. And I was sitting there thinking, why am I here? I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be doing this. And also these children can't tell me if they're okay with me doing this. So I left with a pretty bad taste in my mouth about that experience and a strong feeling that I shouldn't have been there, but I didn't really know why at that point. So I headed off to Cambodia next and jumped into my next volunteer experience, which was teaching English at a primary school. Now, I am not a teacher. I have no desire to be a teacher.
God bless them. Thank you, teachers, for all you do.
Yes. And I have an absolute renewed respect because I have been homeschooling for the past 12
Right.
years. So
Everybody's a teacher now.
Yeah. So I jumped into that, and again, the same feelings came up. What am I doing here? I'm not qualified to do this. And, where do I start? I start at ABC because that's all I know where to start at, and how many other volunteers have come before me and done ABC? And, where is the continuity of education for these children? What do the parents think? What does their teacher think of me? All of these kind of questions were coming up. And again, this like feeling of being an imposter, that I shouldn't be there. And so I continued at it for a little while, but eventually I stopped because the discomfort kept growing. I stayed on in Cambodia and started volunteering again at the local hospital, doing admin work though, which I was perfectly qualified and capable of doing. And I got to know a couple of the families, the street children and their families that were living around that area, and started wondering what was available for them, and realized very quickly from talking to the hospital and other kind of NGOs in that space that there was no one really serving that community at that point in time. There was troubles with access to medical care and food and education and things like that. So I eventually kind of started raising some money to try to bring medical care to them. And that was a mini project that went on for a little while. And then eventually I took the plunge and set up an NGO in Cambodia and raised money in Australia. And I tried to kind of fill the gaps that weren't being filled by existing organizations. But ultimately, I was 23 years old. I was very
a 23-year-old
Wow.
setting up an NGO in a country that is not your own and does not speak your language.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, doesn't it?
I think it sounds brave. I completely love it. Keep going.
Yeah, I guess I thought it was a bit brave too. And certainly the people around me were very encouraging and supportive and told me to do it and keep going, and how amazing I was for doing this. But the reality was, and I think if I'm honest and I look back to those early days, I was completely out of my league. I was swamped. I was naive. I was overwhelmed. I didn't have the technical or educational background to be delivering development interventions to highly vulnerable populations. And I burnt out very, very quickly. And I probably burnt out way earlier than I admitted at the time, and just kept going. And, looking back, I don't regret setting up that organization at all. It was an incredible experience and a learning experience for me. And I do believe that we did support people and, secure better outcomes. But also I have to ask myself, where does the bulk of the benefit go? Is it me who had this amazing experience and a learning experience? Or did we genuinely benefit the people that we were trying to help? And unfortunately, we didn't have impact measurement back in those days, or at least I wasn't doing it. So we don't know. And those are the questions that I ask myself a lot, how do we know that this was good?
I mean, I think a lot of people, I can attest that that's happened in my own life too, from doing overseas mission work, doing education, teaching English overseas. And you struggle with the fact of like, hey, I'm not the best at this. And you're growing so much in your own experience that you certainly can walk away and say, okay, I definitely am a different person as a result of this, but how much good did I create? And so I love to hear your struggle with, how did you process that when you got back, and what did you do with that information, and how did it change the way you either support organizations or deploy other people to go that are more qualified or whatnot? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, look, my organization was a victim of the global financial crisis. We lost all of our money in a very short amount of time. And at that same time, I was pregnant with my first child, and it was just a very challenging and difficult time. And I worked really hard to try to hand over our projects to other organizations as best we could. But what happened was my organization closed down the day before my son was born.
Man, they waited till the last minute, didn't they? They were not going to let you go.
No, and it was, it was letting go of, one baby, because it was my life, and having another one. And it was a really difficult and challenging time for me. And being in Australia and not being able to be there was hard as well. And by that point, I was pretty disillusioned with the whole sector and every part of it. I had seen so many examples of bad development practice, of ineffective projects, of exploitation of local communities, of donor-driven projects which aren't wanted or needed by communities. I'd seen, the big organizations kind of consuming grassroots movements as their own and changing them according to donor needs. And so I was pretty disillusioned, pretty burnt out.
The justice seeker in me is having that heaviness come up in my chest where I am getting upset, and I understand what that feels like. And I think the difference in your story with so many is you leaned into it. And you kind of asked the really tough questions about why and how can we do this better. And I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, look, I did step away for a bit because I had a newborn baby, and that was a whole thing.
A whole ball of wax. Yep. 6 pounds of ball of wax.
Yeah. I stepped away, and I needed a break. I needed to not talk about human rights. I needed to also acknowledge that 5 years of living in Cambodia and working in the human rights sector had caused me to, live in a highly stressed state a lot of the time. So I needed to decompress. I needed to get used to being at home, even though Cambodia was home to me too. It was a process. And I guess in that time, I became quite reflective about why this happened. Why is the industry like this? Why can people like me with no experience and just a whole lot of bravado and drive go and set up an NGO and get funding for it and deliver programs without any accountability or transparency, without anybody questioning me really and saying, what right do you have to do this? And in fact, I got the opposite. I won this whole slew of awards. And, the dominant narrative in that was, here's this young woman who gave up her early 20s to serve the children of Cambodia. That was the narrative, and that was the kind of the hero story.
Right.
But not one of these articles about me, or nobody questioned me about the impact that I was having or my legitimacy to be there doing that. And so I thought a lot about that, and I saw a lot of people going and doing what I'd done, and I felt some pressure and responsibility for being part of the culture that tells young people to go and do this. So yeah, there was a lot of reflection, and then a lot of thought about how can I challenge that narrative somewhat, but also what are the problems in the sector? and why do they exist? And I think I slowly started to explore that through my consulting work, and working with organizations to try to improve practice was kind of the start of that. And then that grew into a whole big thing after that.
I just love this concept, because there are so few people in our industry asking these questions, and these are very, in your words, sticky questions. I mean, this ethics of doing good and how we can be better at doing good. How can we be accountable to our good? I mean, even on your website, which I really encourage everyone to go check out, LeighMathews.com. I mean, we'll put it in the show notes. I mean, Leigh talks about, you know, just being so curious about why and how we do good, and trying to challenge these preconceived ideas and unpacking our motivations to do good. And we all think that we're in the business of helping and serving. And you're kind of challenging this narrative a little bit to say, what if we're getting in the way? Or what if we're not even providing the right services? Or, you know, what if we're not even having this level of accountability for someone? And luckily for us, I mean, you were the type of person that had a level of discomfort and you leaned into it rather than kind of walking away, which I think is incredibly noble. So bravo to you for that. But also just about to kind of shine a light for us on this ethical part of doing good and what our listeners maybe can glean from that.
Yeah, I think today's world has made it very easy for us to engage in what we think of as doing good. You know, there's a whole culture around us that is somewhat indoctrinated into us from a very young age that we are privileged and we have an obligation to help others. And then combine that with the, you know, this globalized, interconnected world that we live in, and you can engage in doing good with a few clicks of a button and get that, you know, that hormonal rush of doing good. And I think what has happened because of that has been that we don't have to think anymore, really. We can buy a pair of shoes on a website and we can click an extra little button and donate $2 extra to an organization that shoe company has decided to partner with, and we can do good and get a little kick at the same time as getting our new pair of shoes. And we don't know who that organization is that they've partnered with. We fully place our trust in the shoe company that they've done their due diligence on the organization that they're partnering with, and that is a good organization delivering sustainable interventions that is ethical. So we're kind of absolved of any responsibility to really investigate what it is that we're contributing to. And we place that trust in the middleman, the middle organization that facilitates this doing good for us. And I think therein lies the problem, is that we are not putting the effort into investigating, for one, why we want to do good in the first place. Why do we want to help? What are the things that we care the most about and how we can have the greatest impact on them? And then who is operating in that space, and is it ethical, and is it sustainable, and can they demonstrate that they are actually having an impact on the issue that they say they are? Doing good has become a commodity. You know, it's something that we want to put on our CVs and our college applications. It's something that legitimizes us as a good person in our communities, in our churches, in our schools, in our peer groups. You know, you can make a career out of doing good, as we all have. Mm-hmm. It's a commodity. And I think when something's a commodity, it's easy to lose the ethical side or the ethical considerations of it. And a really good example is the volunteerism industry. You know, you have on one side people who have good intentions and they want to do good. And on the other side, you have communities and destinations that are in need of support. So there's two sides to that equation. But in the middle, you've got for-profit companies that have no grounding in development practice or ethics. They're tourism companies that are for-profit, and they will take your money and place you in a community. And they will make a shiny, shiny website that says how wonderful their impact is and what an incredible impact you're going to have on this community. And you will trust them. But on the other side, and I can say this because I've worked with many of these companies, there's not a lot of development practice or due diligence going on. These projects are set up to meet the demand of the person that wants to go and do good as a volunteer. They're not set up in response to demand from communities. And so that's a really good example of a company or an industry that has commodified doing good for a huge amount of profit, like something like $2.6 billion a year in profit from the volunteerism sector.
Wow.
So how do you, I love that you're encouraging us to just pause. I feel like a lot of movements this year, COVID has ushered this in, right? We're all analyzing our motivations, our intentions. What are we internalized? What do we think of our worldview? So I love that you're challenging the notion of just because you have good intentions doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the most effective way to help other people. And so what could you guide us to, how do you investigate and figure out what's right and figure out what organizations are doing good and doing the most good? Like, where do you even start? Right? I've got 4 kids. I want them to know and understand and appreciate and love the world. And I think, travel is one of the best ways to do that because you actually get to see and feel and touch. But we definitely wouldn't want to do that at the expense or detriment of those that are, hurting. So how do you do that? How do you do that as a mom, and how do you lead your family? Sorry, that's like 8 questions.
I love it though. But really there's like an accountability question to it. Absolutely. How do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we hold our organization accountable? How do we hold these companies accountable? I think it's a great question, John, or series of questions. Either way.
So go.
Yeah. Look, the accountability is key, I think, and the accountability at different levels. So the self-accountability, the questioning and the examination, why am I doing this? What am I getting out of it? Who benefits? Who benefits the most? How can I be sure that I'm not causing harm? So that's the self-accountability. The accountability for the companies that are profiting off good intentions is, after doing that self-examination, making good choices. It's a capitalist market. They will respond to demand. So if we demand different experiences and different choices, they will come. And I think, it is our responsibility as consumers to do that, because the people that are on the receiving end, on the other side in developing countries, are not high up in the power dynamic.
Right.
They are at the mercy of these companies that bring tourists in. So I think by shifting the demand, we shift the products that are offered. So that's kind of one side of it. The other side of it, I think you make a really good point. We do want our children to engage in the wider world. We do want them to understand that the world isn't confined to their small little worldview. But I think there's a danger in kind of mission trips or student service trips of the intention being for privileged young people to, they say, check your privilege, right?
Privilege, buzzword, yes, of 2020 for sure.
Yeah. But what I think actually happens is that it cements their privilege. It actually reinforces the power dynamic. And why does it do that? Well, for one, it teaches the young people that they're going to interact with in destination communities that privileged foreigners are the sources of power and saviors, and they're here to help us. So it's perpetuating that long, that larger, longer term power imbalance. The other side of it is a lot of these trips involve what I like to call hard labor. So you've got groups of young kids getting really sweaty, digging holes, building walls, doing physical labor, because that's all they're really skilled to do in the terms of development. Sure. And for them, it's eye-opening and challenging. And yes, they see how other people live, but, they really just worked hard for maybe a week. And they came home and went, wow, I'm lucky. And that's how they're cementing that privilege and cementing that power imbalance. And I think there are better ways to engage young people in seeing the world and understanding these really tricky issues around poverty and complex social challenges. And that is through, rather than placing the young person as the helper and positioning them to themselves and to the community as the helper, we need to position them as the learner, because that's their age and stage in life. They're learners, they're young kids, they're teenagers, young adults, and their age and stage is to learn. So if we flip from the I'm here to help you to I'm here to learn from you, it changes things. It places things on a bit more of an equal playing field. And then if we take it a step further and actually craft immersive learning experiences around this rather than helping experiences, then we get to shift that narrative even further.
Okay. Total mind-blowing suggestion right there.
That's really
because
awesome.
I mean, anyone that's in development understands that, if we talk to our donor about their impact, it will have less of an impact than if they saw a picture of it, if they touched it. But we also know that experientially, we want them to be a part of it. And I would even add to what you just said that it doesn't even have to start, I think, with a young person. I can see adults needing to go over and just sort of, it's less of a mission trip and more of a humanitarian effort of, I want to get to know you in the place you're at. I want you to get to know me in the place we're at, find commonality, and let's just, embrace our humanness just a little bit. I just think that is a really powerful way to reframe this entire situation. And you're right. I mean, it becomes a different animal when you bring in capitalist movements and those kinds of things. You've had clearly so many humanitarian experiences and been in so many different countries. You have such a passion for this. I wonder if you would share just with our listeners a powerful story that you've been able to witness that you feel has sort of changed you as a person.
Look, as somebody that, my primary background is in international child protection. So I have seen a lot of things that are very, very challenging. And you develop a pretty thick skin when you work in that space because you have to. And not much phases me because I've seen a lot. But not last year, was it 2018? I went to do a project in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh in the Rohingya refugee camp. And the project was us interviewing children in that camp around their experiences of education and access to education, of which there was none at that point. And for me, it's one of that experience was one of the 2 times in my professional career that I have felt a sense of hopelessness.
Worst feeling in the world when you're working in a mission-based movement.
Yeah. And that was a shock to me, usually no matter what the challenge or the problem, I can see some sliver of hope or a way through or a way to make small incremental changes with the community to change the outcome over the long term. But with this it was an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. And for me, it changed how I looked at my whole career. It changed how I wanted to work. It reignited that sense of injustice that drives me to do this. And I think you kind of, when you've been at it for so long, you don't lose why you're doing it, but it becomes less prevalent. And for me, that feeling of hopelessness and kind of wondering what could change here, and not being able to see anything, was really confronting. And it almost gave me a second wind to try harder, if that makes sense. Not in a way that I believe that I can change things, not in a I can save the world, I can do this kind of thing. More stay in your little space, keep working on having difficult conversations, keep unpacking and exploring and being curious about why there's this level of injustice in the world. Why does this happen? And how can we look at slowly starting to unpack it so that this doesn't keep happening, and that these systems aren't, perpetuating hopelessness and suffering for the foreseeable future for these children.
Wow.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That, Leigh.
Thank you for sharing that. So personal.
So we ask all of our guests, it's a real practical, pragmatic type question of what's one good thing? And I know we could discuss what the word good means all day with you, right? But to us, in this sense, it just means like, what can you do? Is it there a habit or a belief or a mindset change that you could shift today that could really impact your trajectory? And I think you've given us so many good nuggets, but I wonder if you could leave us with something very specific for us to ponder for the day.
The thing that I've learnt recently, which has been a mind shift, for me, has been the importance of listening rather than doing. I'm a doer. I'm a see a problem.
Same these.
Check it off.
Yep. See a problem. How can I fix it? Right. And from my podcast and from all of the guests that I've interviewed, one big thing that I've learned over the past few years is listening, slowing down, listening, because we've been doing forever, it's all doing, and we're not really getting anywhere with the doing. And when we rush ahead and do, we sometimes lose the voices of those who don't speak up as quickly or don't do as quickly, or who think in a completely different way than us. And we lose the opportunity for their perspective to come into the doing. So that's a big thing for me, is the slowing down and the listening before doing. I want to recommend a book which
excellent, bring it.
Really shifted my thinking, and it's called Sand Talk, and it's by an Australian academic, Aboriginal academic writer called Tyson Yunkaporta, and it basically gives us a different perspective in the way people solve complex problems. So complex problem solving. And for me, it was quite mind-blowing, this whole different perspective on how we solve problems and the connections and interconnections between big issues. And so that really made me step back again and go back into that listening space and realize there's so much I don't know.
Yes.
I love that, because it's not just listening, it's also opening up who you're listening to. It's not just muting these voices that you want to not have to struggle through and deal with, but listening and challenging, some of the mindsets that you've got. So I love Love that call.
Yeah, I do too.
So good.
And I think I would even take it a step further just because I have a question, where I feel like, especially all of our American listeners, that are tuning in right now. I mean, I would really like for you to share with our listener base, like what are those differences between philanthropy in the United States and the philanthropy you're in Melbourne, and how can we kind of channel this listening as sort of our endpoint of how we're going to come and self-realize what our end user needs, and talk about just a little bit between the differences of what you have experienced in Australia with what you've witnessed here in the United States. And you don't have to be kind.
Look, I will be kind because I think that the culture of giving is so much more advanced in the US than it is in Australia.
Interesting.
We give, but it's very private. Australian philanthropy is, we like to describe it as an iceberg. And having been someone that's been on both the giving and receiving end of the philanthropy equation, when you are trying to secure philanthropic funding in Australia, you can see this tiny, tiny little tip of the iceberg, and that's all you can access. But then there's this huge iceberg underwater that you can't access unless you know someone. It's not very transparent. And people are very private. Large donors are very private around their giving. And there's been a lot of efforts here in Australia by our peak body, Philanthropy Australia, to challenge that and to open it up, and even brought people over from the US to talk about, implementing a culture of giving. But I think we've got a long way to go. I think that Australians as a general public do give, and they give generously. But when it comes to that higher end giving, it's quite different. And I wonder if there's a cultural element to that. Australians don't like to, we have a phenomenon here called tall poppy syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No, tell us.
Tall puppies.
Okay. Tall
puppies.
Poppy, like the flower.
Poppy. Oh, I love poppies.
I was like, this
animal
is awesome.
lovers here. Sorry, we went right there.
No, tall poppy syndrome is something that's talked about a lot in the Australian culture, and it's that people don't like to promote themselves or talk about their achievements because they'll get cut down. Australians don't like to see people kind of come up.
And now you know why Australians are so humble. Now we know this is culturally ingrained.
It is culturally ingrained. And I mean, look, that's a generalization. It's not everywhere and in every sector, but it's kind of underpinning things. And I think that has seeped in to what philanthropy is here. And so in the States, people are very open about their philanthropy, and big philanthropy. It's kind of like, hey, I did this.
It's kind of the other end of the pendulum, like kind of.
It is. I mean, you add somebody like, my boyfriend, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates throwing out the Billionaires Challenge, and they are literally having people step forward, raising their hand to sign this pledge that says, I'm going to give $500 million away, and here's all the places I'm going to give it. So I mean, that is a stark difference. Yes. Yeah. And it does. I mean, we have a much smaller population than you guys, therefore less billionaires. But still, I think that culture is there, and we need to change that, and it needs to become a more open space, and it's on its way. But I think the capacity of large donors and high net worth individuals to have significant impact is huge, as we know. But I think there really, really needs to be much more strategy and consideration of the ethics of the interventions that they're making, and shifting away from heart-based giving to much more of the head being in control. We know that a lot of giving is done at those levels through, I heard a story and it moved me, and so I'm going to give. Or I know someone who
runs that organization, or my friend donated and it tugged on the heartstrings. So all of a sudden I'm going to give. And for me, that's where a lot of damage is caused, because there's no consideration about the legitimacy of those organizations or the issues that they're working on, or there's no measurement of impact. And that is really, really concerning when you're talking about such large amounts of money.
Mm-hmm. And somewhere across the world, someone is tuning in and they are a very competitive prospect researcher. And they have just heard Leigh say that it is hard to find information on Australian giving. And someone out there is going to say, I am going to go figure out how to unlock Australia and tap into this culture of giving that just kind of needs to be brought to the world. I think that's pretty cool.
So Leigh, people need to follow you because you have these conversations every day on your social media. Will you tell us how to connect with you? I know you like to hang out on Instagram. Where else are you?
I do like to hang out on Instagram. I find there's just interesting conversations going on there.
Right.
So I'm on Instagram at _LeigHMathews. My podcast is on Facebook at The Good Problem Podcast. And I am on LinkedIn if you want to connect with me there.
Wonderful.
She's everywhere. Yeah. Leigh, we have so enjoyed visiting with you. I have enjoyed listening to your accent this entire time. So perhaps you've enjoyed listening to ours. We don't have, I don't feel like we have a very thick Oklahoma accent.
Let's give her some good howdies and y'alls on
yes, the way out. Yes. We just thank you so much for coming into our community and giving us so much to think about. So we'll put some notes into the show notes so you have links to this wonderful book that you've recommended, Sand Talk, and then we'll also have all the connections to Leigh. And I just really encourage everybody to go to her website and read just the raw realness that she puts down out there, because it's really inspiring.
And listen.
And definitely listen.
Create the space to listen.
Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you so much for having me.